This episode is sponsored by the Soul of Business Experience, a leadership community with curated resources for entrepreneurs, solopreneurs, and anyone intent on developing their leadership impact and supercharging their careers. For more information, check the podcast webpage or show notes. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Soul of Business with Blaine Bartlett. I am your host, Blaine Bartlett. Yeah, for years, and I was talking to my guest in the green room before we got started here, and I'll introduce him in just a moment here, but just a little groundwork. In the work that I've done corporately over the last 40 years, it's always fascinated me why some organizations are more successful than others, given that they have essentially the same raw product to work with. And that raw product are, the ideas and the resources of the people and those sorts of things that kind of come into play here. And even in the same market sectors, there are some organizations that excel and some that seem to continuously stub their toes, particularly if there's disruption in their market sector and things just aren't going as well as the plans that they had laid actually suggested that they could. So this is, kind of my short story, a very long story, how I got involved with leadership development, because I basically assessed that, leadership was probably the culprit here one way or another. And that opened up, a very interesting window of exploration for me. And corporate culture became kind of the organizing principle, the framing of a lot of the leadership work that I did. And Warren Bennis years ago famously said that culture will eat strategy for lunch. And I think that was very well spoken. I don't care what your strategy is. If the culture doesn't land it well, you're going to be in a world of hurt. And I think it was Mark Benioff that ended up saying at one point in time that he wanted to amend that because from his perspective, culture will eat strategy for breakfast. Nothing survives culture. And I'm mentioning all of that because my guest today, I've had him on the show before. He wrote a book about a year and a half ago, I think it was, close to that, Fly Fishing for Leaders. And I'm an avid fly fishing aficionado. John just runs circles around me in that regard, but we both grew up in the Pacific Northwest and we fished some of the same rivers together. And when I saw the title of his book, Fly Fishing for Leaders, I went, there's an interesting take there. So I invited him on the show. Fast forward, we're now here. And as you can imagine, there's been so much perturbation going on in the marketplace, with AI, with remote work, with back to work scenarios, all kinds of things. The disruption in terms of the workplace environments have been profound, and how leaders actually assimilate that disruption in a way that actually facilitates effectiveness is the big challenge. And so he's got a new book coming out right now that I've been fortunate enough to get a preliminary or an advanced copy on. A Culture 4.0, the future of corporate culture. And I wanted to have him on the show because I think this is a very timely conversation and a very needed conversation. A little background. John Childress is probably the preeminent culture guru. And I'm going to use the word guru very advisedly. I don't use that word very often at all. And as you cover your eyes, but John co-founded an organization back in, I believe it was 1978, called Sendelani, and it was the first organization that specialized in culture development work from a leadership perspective. They were wildly successful. They did some amazing work with some of the most fascinating organizations that were going through some, just all kinds of different stuff. 3 Mile Island comes to mind as an example, the nuclear meltdown that happened there. And the fix there had more to do with assessing the cultural dynamic rather than the structural dynamics, that were in place from a scientific perspective. John's got a master's degree from Harvard, graduated magna cum laude from the University of California with his BA. I'm going back in time here just a little bit here, but his bona fides are significant. And and he's also playful. So he's worked all over the world with some of the largest companies in the world, doing some amazing work with them. And I am honored to have John Childress back as my guest. So John, welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure, Blaine, and it's always nice to reconnect with you. After all these years, our history sort of intertwines through life. So I'm looking forward to our conversation.
I am too. I want to just jump immediately into both the gestation of the book, but also into the book itself. We had a conversation prior to coming live here that what started out as a relatively modest tome is now over 300 pages. As you got deeper and deeper into this thing, there were it's almost 400 here. Yeah. Okay. So this is a significant undertaking. What were you noticing that compelled you to say, because I've written 6 books and it's kind of like, oh my God, it's like giving birth. What, not having given birth, but I've been told it's kind of similar to that. What compelled you to say, okay, there's a book here and there's a story that needs to be told? What was the catalyst? And then we'll get into what's the story that needs to be told.
Okay, well, great. Thanks. I think it's an interesting reason. I was not going to write another business book. I figured my time has passed. I've done a lot of consulting in corporate culture, leadership. I thought I said it all. And then I had a conversation, Blaine, with a former CEO client. He ran a big aerospace firm out of the US. And he said, John, I am so glad I'm retired. I could not be a CEO in this day and age. I said, why? He says, well, let me draw a picture for you. Imagine one of these old Japanese black and white movies where the shogun has captured the rogue samurai and he's tied him up to a wall and there are 100 archers and they all let loose at once. He says, imagine all those arrows coming at you. There's no place to hide. And he said, that's exactly what's going on today with all the simultaneous changes in business. AI working from, or remote working, I should say, cybersecurity, social media, regulation change, immigration, Gen Z. I mean, it goes on. In fact, when I started thinking about the book and looking at all of the simultaneous disruptions, there's 20 chapters in my book about each one, its impact on leadership, its impact on culture, and most importantly, how forward-thinking companies are dealing with that.
The idea here of change, I mean, not obviously change has always been present. And I learned a long time ago that the problem with change is not necessarily the change itself, because most people in an organization specifically can understand the business case for why we're doing this. The problem that comes into play in my experience is the disruption to existing relationships that the change causes. Relationships that I have with my work process, relationships that I have with my peers, relationships that I have even with the direction, the vision of the organization, the goals and objectives. There's all these relational dynamics. And I think that's where culture comes into play, because culture, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but culture fundamentally is an artifact of relational dynamics in an organization. Is it?
Yes. And let me
Yes, I knew that there was an and
expand
there.
on that, because you've hit on a great point. And I may offend some people when I say this, but I'll say it anyway.
Good. Offend away.
I think for many years, corporate culture has been hijacked by HR and the behaviorists. And what I mean by that is it's all about people's behavior, attitudes, interrelational dynamics, et cetera, which are very important. But in my world of how you affect change and what culture really is, employee behavior is the outcome of culture.
Mm-hmm.
People don't behave illogically. They don't do fraud unless there's some causal mechanism going on. And so I'm looking at culture as a set of organizational policies, work processes, et cetera, that are causal factors. They influence how people behave and think. For example, I mean, just think about it. A new employee joins a company. He's all excited. He wants to fit in, wants to do a good job. 6 months later, he's disengaged. He didn't come in disengaged. He didn't plan on being disengaged. But there are causal factors within the organization. Hard to implement policies, informal work rules, poor supervision, compensation structures that drive the wrong outcomes. All this impacts, and a person wants to fit in, and so they suddenly become acculturated.
Mm,
That makes sense?
that makes perfect sense. Yeah.
So if you want to reshape culture, if it's not allowing your strategy to be as effective as it should be, you don't necessarily change the people, you change those causal factors. What's getting in the way? And that's where management and particularly modern HR leaders need to spend their time thinking. What is it about this organization that gets in the way of people being at their best?
You summarize that, I think, at the very beginning of the book in your introduction. There's actually a quote that I had highlighted. If you don't understand what drives your corporate culture, you don't understand your business.
Well, that's how I look at it.
Yeah. And that these causal factors. If we've got all of this stuff that's, you highlighted just a moment ago here, AI, we've got disruptions. We got, I think we've got 5 different generations in the workforce right now. I mean,
Exactly.
it's from a leadership perspective, I'm this guy on this wall and I've got these arrows coming at me. What do I do? Because the tenure of a CEO, the average tenure of a CEO, particularly a Fortune 100 CEO, is about 3 years now.
Yeah, I know it's gone down.
Yeah. So what is it that I can legitimately start directing attention towards? Because I'm not going to fix it as a CEO, but I can direct my people to start paying attention to certain things. And I've got to start noting what those things are in order to have things happen.
Well, I think you have to sort of become a detective, if you will. Hercule Poirot, if you will. You have to get around and watch what's going on. You have to ask people what frustrates you, what gets in the way of you doing what you think is great work. And you have to sort of avoid what they say about this person bothers me or that person's negative. You got to keep probing for what are the structural causal factors. What policies do people tend to work around because they're just so onerous? And then the CEO needs to step back and think, which policies, work processes, or set, et cetera, in my industry have the most impact? And if it's a technology company, I think the causal factors are different than if it's a retail company. Um, and do some sort of triage and look at those, and then look at what are the best practices about policies that support strategy execution, hiring profiles that best fit what we're trying to create in this company. Onboarding, is our onboarding fit for purpose?
I was going to ask about that because I mean, if we're bringing new people in, by definition, we're going to be bringing different
Old
variables.
cultures into exactly.
Exactly. So can you talk a little bit about not just not first, back that up. Talk a little bit about the hiring process, kind of from a selection perspective, what do I select for? And then the actual onboarding process. How does this all work in terms of generating and consistency in a cultural dynamic, in the cultural
Yeah.
stew?
Okay. Well, I think that this is where HR can really add great value. Okay. If you're building a hiring profile, you shouldn't build it for the culture you've got. You should build it for the culture you need tomorrow and in the future. So what are the characteristics that people need to have? Not what are their background, not what are their technical skills. Those can be added. But what's the character of a person you need? How do they respond to criticism? How do they respond to challenges? And you can probe all of that in interviews. Why are they coming here? What do they want to deliver? Why is this company good for them? Okay, you've got to really get deep on that. Second of all, I think most onboarding programs are crap. They're mostly policies. Policies, check boxes, read the manual. You got any questions? Here's your supervisor. And then as soon as the supervisor gets out of the HR office, he says, forget all that crap. I'll tell you what to do.
Yep.
And that becomes the culture. So you really need to have a robust onboarding program. Do you realize that most senior executives don't get onboarding? They get the policies, they get the manual, but they don't get anything about the culture, the characteristics of team dynamics we need to make this strategy really work. Somehow they get exempted, and yet organizations are shadows of their leaders.
Yeah. That's an interesting point. I remember when I was doing a lot of work with Starbucks, at their senior level, executive level. And after Howard Schultz had first time he'd retired in this scenario, Jim Donaldson, I think it was Jim Donaldson. Yeah. Anyway, they brought in this new guy. But what was interesting, they didn't put him into position right away. They put him into the roasting plant. They put him into a store.
Exactly.
Yeah. And it was a 6-week, I think it was 6 weeks, something like it, a 6-week long deep dive into here's who we are. Here's who we are.
Here's how things really get done around here.
Yeah.
So to me, that is a best practice in onboarding. So they're out there to research. And if a company really wants to impact the causal factors and make them positive rather than neutral or negative, then look for the best practices.
There was a statistic, and I don't have it at my fingertips. Perhaps you can actually bring this up, but a study that was done as part of the book of, I think, about 1,700 executives, senior executives, looking at culture and the percentage structures. And I forget exactly the question that was asked here, and my apologies for that. But, before we came on air, I was asking you about a correlation between Gallup's workplace engagement survey and this particular survey that was looking at the nature of culture in an organization. And the statistics were, they looked very similar. And I was wondering if there was a correlation between disengagement and lack of attention towards culture.
Well, I think so. I think if we're talking about the kind of culture I'm talking about, which is organizational systemic culture.
Exactly.
There is definitely, and as I've just said, lack of engagement. People don't come into the workforce disengaged. They come in excited and somehow they get disengaged. And that's because of the organizational cultural structures that are going on, the causal factors.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I think that study said that a large percentage, over 70% of the executives said culture is very important for implementing and executing on our strategy.
Mm-hmm.
When asked the question, is your culture adequate or designed for your structure? 16% said no.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the inference that I make out of that is they recognize it, but they let it develop organically without intention.
Right. It's not their job. It's HR's job. And that's where the gap and the breakdown comes.
That's where the supervisor takes the new hire under their wing and go, I'll tell you how it really works here.
Yeah. And if you want to get ahead, you'll listen.
Yeah.
And so they come up against that kind of a supervisor, but they also come up against structural issues, particularly policies, particularly work practices. Most policies and work practices were designed years ago when the company was evolving.
Yeah.
Hey, man, it's a new world. There's so many disruptions and so many different kinds of employees. Policies don't fit for all. We need to rethink those so that they drive the right behaviors.
That's interesting because in the book, you've got a chapter on corporate culture for Gen Z. You've got a chapter on gray power, the aging workforce. You've got a chapter on entrepreneurials. Each of these are different classes and they've got different attributes associated with them, obviously. Can you talk a little bit about, and this is close to my heart here, the gray power dynamic here? Yours and my hair both are kind of this kind of. Where does the aging workforce come into play? Because Ford just announced that they were rehiring a lot of gray hairs back into the engineers, back into the workforce, because AI isn't doing what it needs to, what they thought it was going to be doing in terms of quality, in terms of basically assuring that they're going to get what they want out from the processes that they've implemented. Where does this come into play? Or more
Engaging work
specifically, how does this come into play?
house comes into play. Yeah. Well, you've asked sort of two intersecting questions there. The aging workforce, which is a big part of things. There's very little time spent inside organizations listening to people and listening to their experience and calibrating that against what's kind of going on in the modern world. Not everything modern works. All the AI hype is not going to solve every problem. Some of the gray hairs like you and me have seen things and seen successes and failures that we need to share. And so the level of collaboration and respect, it's like collaboration between functions or between departments. If that doesn't happen, that was the genesis of the 3 Mile Island accident. Yes, a pump broke down, but there was lack of communication along the chain between functions or departments. The same thing is true about people within a function. If you've got Gen Zs, if you've got older people in great power, getting them to respect and understand different points of view and bringing those different points of view to the solution is really an important thing.
Well, that's bringing divergent points of view to the solution with the move towards, and this gets to, I think if this is also a social push on cultural dynamics, the whole politicization, if you will, of DEI initiatives and diversity. I don't know a high performing team that does not value diverse opinions. And the makeup of these teams, are diverse. They're not homogeneous. They are heterogeneous in a very specific and designed sort of a format. How, how does a leader actually counteract the politicization, if you will, of a DEI initiative? In their workplace.
Well, it can become a weapon. And I think we've seen that. And that's certainly not productive for any person or any organization when you exclude points of view about the solution, not necessarily their political or their personal
Right.
points of view, but let's focus on the solution. And I think that's where leaders need to take a firm stand. Look, we're talking about what are the best ideas, the best knowledge we can bring to this solution. Forget about where you come from. Forget about the fact that it's from India or Mexico or wherever these people come from. We hired them because they're good, but they come with different points of view, which could be of value because our customers are diverse.
Exactly.
Let's be realistic. You can't have a one-dimensional corporate culture when you're serving a multi-dimensional set of customers. So you really need that. And I think that's where the respect and the listening and the taking a stand on the best solution for the problem. The other thing is, excuse me.
Yeah, no, let go. Yeah.
The other thing about diversity is not every person is fluent in English. They may speak well, they may write well, but there's a lot of idioms in the US that don't translate well. There's a lot of ways of thinking in foreign countries that we're not accustomed to. So you really need to listen deeply.
Mm-hmm.
Listen with your ears open and your mind open, because there are particular solutions that come out of those conversations that are extremely important to helping move your strategy along.
And I would think that one of those evolutionary things has to do with literally the evolution of middle management. And I'm thinking here again of the supervisor that has taken that new hire on. And this is where the rubber meets the road. The culture interface, if you will, oftentimes is that middle management tier. I can be the CEO and be directing. I can be the president and be directing, but Nothing gets done unless this middle management tier is actually executing, and how they execute makes the difference. Not
You know,
just closing the gap on, here's the goal, go get it, but the how question, how do we go get it, comes into play.
middle management is critical because they are the translators of the strategy into day-to-day action. Okay. That's how I look at it. Their role is not to oversee anymore because it's hard to oversee when you have remote working. So you need to move your middle management skills from overseeing work to helping encourage outcomes. We really look at outcomes. It doesn't matter where you work, what hours you work. Are you getting the outcomes that are required, and what do you need to kind of do that? And I lost my train of thought. Sorry.
No, that's fine. No, that idea of outcomes, I there's a distinction that I'll make in the work that I do with the clients with whom we work between the success criteria, which is the goal was achieved, ta-da, and the succeeding criteria. And we could euphemistically call that the KPIs or whatever, we want to, but too often I think the focus is on that outcome, that end point, rather than what's going on such that the KPIs, again, as an example here, these succeeding criteria are being either missed or hit. And a lot of that is in the how. How are we working together? How are we communicating across departments and divisions and that sort of thing? With in if I've got let's just say 3 different generational workers in place here, and I'm trying to get work done across cultures here. Where does the group? And I know that this is kind of a what would be the word I'd use here? Hypothetical, I guess, situation come into play here. I've got 3 different generations trying to do something to deliver something here. What do I need to be paying some attention to as a supervisor that has a bias towards gray hair? And I've got these 3 different generations because they're all going to be listening different. They're all going to have different values in sense of what's important to me. How do I begin to create a common denominator, I guess would be one way that I could look at that.
You know, offsites and team buildings have sort of fallen by the wayside.
Mhm.
And yet, with that kind of diversity, or the same thing as if you got a group working from home or working remotely, the same time members of the same department are in the office, you can easily have a 2-tier or a 3-tier kind of a culture. And
Yeah.
that's not productive. And so supervisors and managers need to be what I call cultural architects. They need to design the work experience such that people get to know each other. They get to understand where they're coming from. They get to see their points of view. And that does not happen over Zoom.
That's
As
true.
much as this remote technology is great, it's crap for really getting a feel for a human being. And so we need to sort of reinstate those real get-togethers, and not just a meeting, but to get to know, get to understand, get to experience other points of view, and get to learn to trust your colleagues. And trust only comes from familiarization.
And I think that's a perfect, kind of landing place for us here. It kind of goes back to, all an organization is at the end of the day is a collection of people in relationship. That's all any organization is. And if the
Well,
relationships are working well, you got a pretty good shot of being successful. Trust is the foundation of relational dynamics.
trust is definitely it. I would say that your product is important too,
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. You gotta
and your
so
financial capital,
yeah,
but those 3 things got to work together.
yeah.
Uh, and
And
they all
that's
have,
culture.
yeah,
We
that
gotta work
is,
together.
that is the organizational culture I'm talking about. And that's what I talk about in my book. And I even bring up a model of how you look at what are the causal factors and how do you rank the causal factors and what are the best practices.
Yeah.
So,
Where can people find out more about the work you're doing, John, and the book itself? Because it hasn't come out yet. But
yes, it has. It
it
has
has. It
just
is now. It is
it
now out.
just launched in the U.S. on the 23rd of June.
Okay, brand
So
new.
you can find
Okay,
it on Amazon, most major bookstores.
of course. Yep.
You could find out more about me at my website, which has got a lot of my background and some podcasts and posts and blogs and things. It's www.johnrchildress.com.
Okay, johnrwchildress.com.
Yeah, you have to have the R in there because when I was getting it, somebody else had johnchildress.com.
There you go. Okay. Okay. We'll have that in the show notes for sure. And the title of the book, folks, you're going to want to get a copy of this. If you're leading an organization, if you're managing anybody in an organization, your culture is going to determine in large part how successful you end up being at the end of the day. Maybe not today, but over the long haul. The culture makes a difference. Culture 4.0, the future of corporate culture. John Childress, my friend, thank you.
Pleasure, Blaine. And you'll be interested to read that there's a lot about Starbucks in there as well.
I am looking very much forward to picking this thing up and dissecting it.
Because they've done some really good culture work.
They really have. I mean, I'm very impressed with the work that they've done and continue to do. It's interesting.
Yeah, it's a little spotty now, but
Yeah,
anyway,
but I think they got the right focus. Yeah,
it
my
is.
my daughter has been with them for about 20 plus years, and
Really?
and
Oh,
she
great.
speaks and she works at their corporate office here in Seattle. She's always talking about just kind of how it feels there. And
Well, a good friend of mine is Dave Olson, who was their head of people and culture for a
yep,
long time.
yep, I know who he is for sure. Okay, my friend, John Childress, folks, thank you for listening. As always, at the sign off here, I'm going to be talking about finding ways in your life to be a center of distribution, not a center of accumulation. That's the way that nature works. Find a way to give something away. There is nothing in nature that lives long term solely as a center of accumulation. It will kill you. Give something away. Give a hug, give a smile, tip the bill. Make your waiter happy. And I will see you on the next episode. John Childress, thank you very much for being a wonderful guest. I appreciate it.
My pleasure, Blaine.
This episode is sponsored by the Soul of Business Experience, a leadership community with curated resources for entrepreneurs, solopreneurs, and anyone intent on developing their leadership impact and supercharging their careers. For more information, check the podcast webpage or show notes.
Hi, I'd like to ask you to do something for me if you wouldn't mind. If you like this episode, I'd like you to not only subscribe on your favorite site, but I'd also like you to give a rating. Ideally, a 5-star rating would be greatly appreciated. But I think more importantly also would be just some comments. That helps with the algorithm and it helps build the audience with this. And more than anything else, if you could invite somebody else to listen, just share this episode with a friend, with a colleague. And I'd like to see how we can grow the soul of business. I think it makes a difference. Thanks.